I speak rather softly, excuse me, softly sometimes, so I'm going to come up here where there is a microphone and say thank you. First of all, President Spellings, thank you very much for the invitation to come over here. I appreciate it very much. I'm sure each of you know that the system you have here in North Carolina is one that is widely admired across the United States. It's a very well respected system. It certainly is in Tennessee. As a former mayor of Nashville, I can tell you that there's been a lot of effort and discussion over the years about how do we in Nashville replicate through Vanderbilt and our healthcare industry the kind of thing you have in the Research Triangle over here, and the kind of very, very warm and mutually supportive relationship between the university community and the business community is something which is admired across the United States. I was also have been involved with a project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called the Lincoln Project, looking particularly at public research universities. And we actually held a meeting over here and had some people, and I think, Anna, I think you were at that meeting if I'm not mistaken, and Carol Folk was here, and Prima was down here. Oh, there you are, down in the short. And also Randy Woodson responded to our request for information with a really long, thoughtful letter, which was passed out to all of the members. So this group has been very engaged with that effort as well. David Price, who's a member of Congress, of course, was at that meeting as well from here. When Margaret called me on the phone about this, she said you were beginning a formal strategic planning process, and this was kind of the official kickoff meeting for the current process, and asked me to speak to those issues. I'm not going to talk about the general process of strategic planning. The world is full of consultants that do that. I'm sure the university has got people all over the place who know a lot about that and can help guide and lead these discussions. But really to talk about just some of my specific experience that I've had, and things that from that experience I would hope that you might consider considering and talking about during that strategic planning process as well. I believe deeply in the importance of higher education. I think that becomes clear, but I'm also a governor who had to justify higher education to a lot of people who didn't share the automatic commitment to it of the people who were in this room. I'm somebody who had to cut funding a couple of times for higher education and bear the brunt of the thoughts of the various chancellors and presidents for that, and so on. And what I want to come here today to do was really do two things. First of all, talk about three things that I hope you would consider in the strategic planning process. And then second of all, toward the end of my term as governor, we made some substantial changes in the higher education model in Tennessee. I don't know how applicable those are here. Everyone is different and everyone has different circumstances. But we'd like to just lay them on the table, perhaps as food for thought or something that might stimulate your own thoughts about some of the things that might be considered. During the time that I was governor, and really subsequently, in the two commissions I've served on, this one with the American Academy and then one with the associated governing boards on the governance issue, one of the things that became clear to me is that more so than in most areas that I've dealt with, there is a real gap between the way the Academy sees itself and the way the outside public, I think, often looks at it and views it. I would sit in these meetings, and the approaches and thoughts of the faculty members and the administrative staff members were often very much at odds with the perception you have if you go out into the community and talk about things. And I think the heart of that is that the Academy, and I'm using that as shorthand for the faculty and the administrators, and in a sense, people around this table in this room who are here because of a strong belief in the value of higher education. I think the Academy takes it as an axiom that what it does is valuable. It has economic impact. It affects the income of students, and the public, on the other hand, I think often doesn't see this as quite so axiomatic. They look in higher education in terms of what will it do about things that I care about for myself, for my kids, for my grandchildren. You know, when it comes to spending money, spending resources on things, I have lots of places to put it. My government has lots of places to put it. What is it that higher education offers in contrast with some of those other kinds of things that is meaningful for me? I think the two words that describe that I want to leave you with is intrinsic and instrumental. The Academy sees value as intrinsic. You have to be sort of a Neanderthal to think that it's anything other than a wonderful thing to have and invest in. And I guess I'm going to have to explain to you why it is we're so great, because you just don't understand. The public sees it as instrumental. What does it do to advance things that I care about? Is it a useful tool in my building a better life for myself and for my children? About 3 years ago, I chaired the governance commission of the AGB. That's you belong to it. This is sort of the industry group for trustees and members of boards of governors. And the group that I chaired had a lot of higher education professionals in it. There were college presidents, there were faculty members, there were experts from the subject areas of leadership out of the business schools, for example, and those kinds of things. One of the things that I did, and I guess it was in the second meeting, was to bring in a researcher from Peter Hart and Associates, who are one of the big national polling firms, just to talk to them about what information they had drawn from the various pollings that they had done related to higher education, and make a presentation on it. And it was interesting to me because the people around the table were astonished at the public's views of higher education. And in particular, the public is completely consumed with this notion of the cost of higher education and the debt that goes along with sending children to college, something that was kind of brushed off from within the academy. It's just, well, you know, it just costs a lot of money to do the kinds of things that we do. And I think one of the most helpful things in this governance process was to have people to really start to understand the extent to which the public is increasingly demanding justification for the kinds of investments that you all and me were seeking to make in higher education. And of course, every time a student graduates from college with a load of debt and no job, it just sort of underlines that particular problem more. So I noticed when you began talking about the subject of economic impact, which was on the agenda for this morning, I mean, that really is a part of the whole process of justifying yourself to the larger public, and the larger public being the legislature, the public at large, and all the other constituencies out there. I went back and read before I came over here that 2015 report that you all did demonstrating the collective economic value of the UNC system, and I thought it was valuable, but really wanted to caution you that I think it really is only a modest first step in terms of this process of justifying. And I'm hoping that as part of your strategic planning process, you can look at how you show that value in a much more direct and far less abstract way than a bunch of charts and figures and billions of dollars and those kinds of things. I think the change or the attitude that people have to adopt in this is to stop thinking in terms of saying, you know, here's what we want, here's what we need, and rather think in terms of, okay, what does the state need from us? What do the individual citizens in the state need from us? And how in our strategic planning process can we organize ourselves to meet those needs? It's really kind of marketing salesmanship 101, which is stop talking about what you want and start trying to understand what the customer really is looking for. And to do that, I think you've got to find ways to present the value of higher education in very concrete and ways that are meaningful to people's lives. When I was in college, my college degree is in physics, and I had a physics professor. His name was Don Edwards, and he told me one time, if somebody asks you a question about something in physics, and you say to them, oh, that's very complicated, but until you've taken your course in, I don't know, partial differential equations or something, I really can't say, it's hard for me to explain that to you. And he said, no, if you have to say that, that's a measure that you don't really have the full comprehension of your subject. That if you really have command of your subject, you can say something intelligible about it and meaningful about it to anybody at any level of sophistication who's an interested listener. And I think that may be true in physics. I think it's true in the world as large, and in terms of politics or the larger world, I call it the Walmart test. And what I used to do as governor is, if I had some policy that I wanted to advance, I would forget about what the press said and forget about what this, and certainly forget about what the various advocacy groups say, and imagine myself stopping somebody in the aisle of a Walmart and explaining to them what it was I wanted to do and why I wanted to do it. And if I could do so successfully in the aisle of a Walmart, I probably had a reasonable approach. If I had to wave my arms and, talk about white papers and billions of dollars and those kinds of things, I probably didn't have a very useful approach. And I have to say that approach had served me very well over the years of trying to bring these things home outside of the sort of immediate circle that these decisions take place in, and try to find ways to talk to people about it in their terms. And I don't mean talking down to them. I mean just understanding that somebody in the aisle of the Walmart doesn't think about higher education every day, doesn't automatically think it's the best thing in the world, wonders why the state sends money on that instead of fixing the road in their neighborhood and other things that are meaningful to them. And I think it's really important that we figure out how to do that. So when I said I'd talk about thoughts about that, the first thought is I hope that as you go through this, you would consider taking this idea of things like economic impact and expanding it to really a clear, down-to-earth, personally relevant explanation to ordinary citizens of why higher education, why the UNC system is worth supporting. And as I said, it's marketing 101. I mean, think about what it is the customer wants. What does North Carolina need from us? What do its citizens need and want from us? And then what do we have to do to meet those needs as the foundation of the strategic planning process? The second item that I wanted to mention with regard to the strategic planning process is that one thing that became very clear to me as governor, and even more so in the stuff that I'd done after I left office there, is that the reality is the business model for higher education is changing. It's just, it's different, and particularly and talking public higher education here, state support is declining everywhere in 50 states across the country. That is the tendency that I found on a lot of trustees is to sort of say, well, we just need to lobby the legislature a little harder and tell them to step up and do what's right. Or the hope for improved economic conditions. Maybe the economy will be better next year and we'll get some more money or something like that. But the reality is that what's happening now is not that 50 governors and 50 state legislatures have suddenly decided that they don't like higher education as much as they used to, but rather that there have been some fundamental structural changes in state finances, which are what are really driving these changes. Sometimes I'm in a conservative state like you are, and sometimes people sort of blame it on the conservatives, but the same thing is happening in New York, the same thing is happening in California, the same thing is happening in Massachusetts. It's not an ideological thing, it's a change in the structural nature of state government. And what's happening is that states are becoming more and more the administrative arm of the federal government, and what that means is that more and more of the finances of the state are moving beyond the direct control of the legislature. It's happening in a lot of places. It's happened with things like No Child Left Behind. It's happened with infrastructure, where the federal government's investment in infrastructure is declining precipitously compared to what has been in the past, and states are having to step up. You do need to repair bridges, and you do need to fix roads and build roads. Obviously, the 2008 recession has been hard on pensions, even in states that have done a good job of funding their pension plans. It's been hard on those, and that's produced pressure. But the big one, I point out, and this is a fine program. I don't I'm not criticizing the program. The big one is Medicaid. Medicaid is absolutely the elephant in the room when it comes to state funding. And frankly, within the academy itself, you get very mixed views, because on one hand, it's affecting the funding of everything else. On the other hand, as you probably know, Chancellor, every medical school in the country is busy lobbying for more Medicaid money in their institutions. So you get very different things. You know, North Carolina is in a kind of interesting position, and I think it's got good and bad aspects to it. Obviously, the appropriations per FTE have been going down. The chart that I saw said about 20% over the last since the recession, which is more than the average across the country. Tuition increases have been among the higher in the country. Those are the bad news. The good news is you're still among the highest state-supported institutions in the country. I believe it was the 4th in the country when I looked at in the list, and the tuitions are still amongst the lowest in the country. So the danger in that is that it'd be easy to be complacent in the face of these changes in the business model. But the opportunity really is that I think this system has much more than the usual amount of opportunity to make these changes in a thoughtful manner, to have a kind of soft landing in this new world, rather than having to sort of face these emergency situations like California has been doing for the last couple of years, for example. And if as a part of the strategic planning process, you can begin to step up to that issue, I think the foresight of people in the past, the legislature and the governors in the past, and the way this has been funded, really gives you some elbow room and some opportunities and some flexibility that most states don't have to deal with these issues. I mentioned Medicaid, and I believe in back of the envelope calculations. I think they help you just sort of see the big picture on things sometimes. And I went and looked up across the 50 states how state budgets have changed, and the base year I used was 1987. How state budgets have changed since 1987 in terms of the proportion of money they put into different things. And for example, if somebody was spending 10%, a state was spending 10% of their revenues, and then 20 years later was spending 8%, that would be a 20% decline in the proportion. And when you put these things in the big buckets, and obviously there's issues with these because states accounts for them differently. Public assistance has gone down 67%. That's largely the 1990s welfare reforms driving that. Transportation is down 30%. Higher ed is down 16%. Elementary and secondary, K through 12 or pre-K through 12, is down 11%. Other is down 7%. Corrections are up 3%, and Medicaid is up 232%. Okay, all of the changes in other parts of the state budget are completely explainable by what has happened with Medicaid. And until this country and until individual states begin to deal in some substantive way about this, it's going to continue to be a problem. And of course, the reason states are affected is that at the federal government, they've got problems, but they just borrow. 49 of the 50 states do not have the legal ability to borrow for operating expenses, and in 35 of them, it's a constitutional prohibition. And so we're all faced with if Medicaid goes up by $1, and the tax revenues stay the same, we got to find $1 somewhere else to take out of that. And what's happening is it's affecting every other part of state government. And higher education is a particularly vulnerable place because it's kind of a balance wheel. You can always raise tuition a little bit and get some of that money back. And it's very tempting, I can tell you, for governors and legislatures to look at higher education for cuts because they do have other alternative sources for funds, unlike, say, children's services or some of these other kinds of institutions. Bottom line here, is that any enterprise has got to have a business model that works. It's got to provide a product that people want at a price that they're willing to pay. That's obviously true for private companies like a General Motors or an Apple. It's also true for higher education. And obviously we pay for higher education in more complex ways than we do for an iPhone or a Chevy. But the basic equation still holds that every enterprise needs a sustainable business model. And that, things are changing right now for higher education. And that's not something, it's not unusual. I mean, nothing remains static, and organizations have always had to continuously reinvent reinvent their business model and how they do business with the world to take into account changes that are happening in the external environment. Some, I mentioned Apple and General Motors, for a reason. Some, like Apple, do so successfully. Others, like GM, perhaps less so. And I guess the challenge I throw out to you is, how does the UNC system be more like Apple and less like GM as these changes take place over the years and over the decades? When it comes to fixing the business model, there are a few areas that we'd identified in this Lincoln project as worth focusing on, and I would just mention them to you. First of all, I really do think that you have to take, from the standpoint of convincing a legislature, convincing the public, you've really got to take the lead in the way of becoming more efficient. And by more efficient, I don't mean just trimming a little overhead here or something there, but really questioning some of the kinds of things that you do. The way some people try to address that is by incorporating requirements to propose cost savings as part of the annual budgeting process, not let the annual budgeting process just be, here's our base budget and here's all the new things we want, but also here are some offsets. When I was governor, even in years when we were going to be able to grow the budgets, I would ask people to propose 3% and 5% cuts just so I could see what was on the margin for them at least. And maybe there was something they wanted that was worth putting even more money in by taking some out of some of those existing kinds of things. Certainly, there is an opportunity for a board like this to lead multi-year initiatives to look at fresh things. Something which is very hard, believe me, I know it in the academy, but really has got to be looked at is just pruning less successful programs. I look at these times when times are tough as actually being some real opportunities. You've all seen some National Geographic special that shows how the bad winter makes the weak elk in the herd die off and strengthens the herd. Well, the same thing happens in organizations. There are things you can't do when times are good and money is there, but when times get tight, it's an opportunity just to look at some of these kinds of things and to, surely there's no organization that didn't start something 15 years ago that they had high hopes for, and it hasn't turned out quite like they thought it might. And so maybe it's a candidate for some pruning. So one item is just I really think that you need to have credibility. You need to be leading the way in terms of how you become more efficient and more effective in the way that money is spent. Second of all, I really think you're going to see private philanthropy become a much more central component of the financial model of public institutions than it is now. Obviously, there are plenty of institutions, including a number of them right here, I understand, who are working on capital campaigns for various purposes and so on. And I acknowledge that. But private universities also have these very aggressive annual campaigns. They work very hard at long-term grooming of potential donors and the like. As I mentioned, I'm a graduate of Harvard, and believe me, there is not a week that goes by that I do not get some sort of thing. And it's really depressing because once you turn 65, which I have now, immediately they assume you're going to die tomorrow, and so they start asking you about all these questions about your estate planning and sending you brochures about how you can do this and that and the other. But I really think that for a public institution to start looking at what some of the big successful privates do and starting to put together the kind of operation that brings in these substantial annual fund gifts, that brings in the large gifts and the large endowment to do that is going to be one of the necessities to do it. And in general, my experience has been is they're not very focused. The publics are they're not nearly as focused on this as the privates are. The third thing is to work with the legislature that if you can't restore funding to what it used to be, let's at least work together to find out how to get some consistency to the funding. I've talked to any number of college presidents, certainly when I was governor and since then, who can live with, X minus 10%, but they need to know that it's X minus 10% for the next 5 years, not X minus 10 this year, X plus 5 next year, X minus 15 the year after that. In Tennessee, we have, for K through 12 education, we have a thing called the Basic Education Plan, which is it's a funding formula for the schools. And it is, I mean, it's a mantra of both Republicans and Democrats that you fully fund that BEP every year. In the toughest years of my time in 2008, when, you know, just the revenues were falling, we fully funded the Basic Education Plan because we didn't think the public schools could live with the kind of variability that comes with, oh, you get a 10% decrease this year, and, you know, we'll try to get it back in 2 years and so on. And we do that by having reserve funds that are used for it, and we put into them in good years, and we pull out in bad years, but there's a bunch of processes that you all would know how to do that. Higher education, I believe, would benefit from a similar thing, and it's the sort of thing that I think a legislature you'd find a lot of willingness in a legislature about finding some ways to do that. The other secret to the BEP I'd mentioned to you is we also have a funding plan for higher education. The BEP is funded at 100% always as to what the plan shows, and the plan is realistic, and it's not funded at 99%. If you try to do it at 99, people will get on your back in a hurry. The higher education plan is funded like 73% or something. I tried to get them to reset that, Talk the Academy, reset that at 100 and let's sort of pin it there. And they never had an interest in doing that because then, you just want to kind of dream about getting that other 27% back sometime. So what happens now, though, is it just flops all over the place. I mean, if 73 is the right number, why isn't 72 the right number? Or why isn't 70 the right number, and how big of a difference is it? But some plan which is consistent, in which you put money in good years and take money out in bad years to provide some consistency of funding is something I think you could ask the legislature to do. And I suspect, and certainly in Tennessee, you would find a lot of interest on both sides of the aisle in trying to structure something like that, and I really believe could be of help. I say all this about these things in 2008, when we started having to do some pretty tough things with all the departments, including higher education, the way I answered some of the whining, for lack of a better word, from the academy was to say, look, here's the problem we've got. You justify yourself all the time as we are the centers of innovation. This is where innovation and entrepreneurship comes from, and that's what academics do. And I just said, well, fine, show me some of that innovation. We've got a problem, and it's not going to go away, and it's not something that we've caused out of a bad attitude towards something. We need some help in doing this. You've got a lot of smart people. Be a partner with us, with government, in terms of solving these problems, as opposed to simply one more supplicant always coming up and saying, no, my thing is more important than what it is that you're asking for over here. The third thing that I wanted to mention is this, and the last of these. As you might imagine, I have both done strategic plans and read innumerable strategic plans in the business world, in the nonprofit world, and certainly in government, where we would ask departments and agencies for these kinds of things. And a common failing in all of those groups is that they produce these plans that are just pablum. They don't have any bite to them. They don't really differentiate. They don't really make choices. In the business world, you find some plan that says, our plan is we're going to become a consumer-driven company focused on quality. We're going to be a good place for our associates to work. And say, well, fine, but what does that all mean? I presume in higher education, as you say, you're going to be accessible and diverse and provide every student with the tools they need to succeed in the 21st century workplace and all those kinds of things. We'll find what does that really mean? The test I've always told people to use, I ask people to use, is to say, okay, if it's a strategy, the test is, can you take its negation? Can you take the opposite of that? And is that also a plausible strategy? Okay. And that means you've made a choice between two plausible kinds of things, as opposed to just sort of regurgitated, some very nebulous goals. Obviously, if you say we're going to be consumer driven, it doesn't meet that test because no company is going to say, well, we're going to ignore our customers and consumers. And I presume that if you talk about accessibility, you're not going to say, well, we plan to be a college only for white male students or something, or something like that. But if, for example, in higher education, you said, as part of a strategic plan, we're going to focus on increasing the number of tenure track positions and decreasing the amount of adjunct professorships we have. Well, I can make, you can make an argument the other side of that. I mean, that actually is a strategy that represents making a choice between one or two different kinds of things that a reasonable person could argue either side of. When I was writing this down, I was thinking about World War II, and which is the last war we actually won. I think in large part because the country employed, a very good strategic vision of how to go about winning that war. And that strategic vision wasn't, we're going to field excellent troops and promote freedom and democracy everywhere and stuff. It was, we're going to fight Europe first and Japan second. We're going to deal with North Africa as opposed to X or Y or Z. We're going to concentrate resources on securing the North Atlantic supply line. And in so doing, you say, okay, I'm not going to worry about the Balkans right now, and I'm not going to worry so hard about Japan right now. You're making some choices. And to me, any strategic plan has that aspect of you've said some things you're going to do that really represent some choices among available alternatives, and then you really have a strategic plan. So the 3 points that I mentioned, just to summarize, first of all, is this issue of being outwardly focused. I guess to channel John F. Kennedy, it's ask not what your state can do for you, ask what you can do for your state in higher education. The second one is just to evolve the business model to be Apple and not GM, to not be static at a time when the outside world is changing. And the third of all is to, just develop some plans with some bite that actually makes some choices among available alternatives and set some directions. The other thing I wanted to do, and I'll do so quickly so we have a little bit of time to talk, is toward the end of my time as governor in Tennessee, we went through a significant series, we call them reforms, changes in any event, in higher education. And I wanted to mention to you what a couple of those were, with the idea of mind, again, if they may or may not be relevant, they may be usable to you, they may stimulate some thinking on your part about your own particular problems. There's no question that Tennessee and North Carolina and the systems are very different and have different things. But 18 months before I left office, I set up a group, a committee, that was sort of broadly based. It was certainly bipartisan. It had the chairs of the relevant committees in the legislature. It had the lieutenant governor, who's elected totally separately from, and in my case, from a different party, from the governor. It also had the comptroller. It had a couple of interested community people, but just a broad thing. And I actually chaired it. It was not a matter of I said, go off and send me a report. I actually spent the time and we sat down and met with them. To come up with some ideas about what we might do to move the agenda in higher education forward. When it started, everybody thought it was going to be about governance. Everyone wanted to say, well, let's change the way the board selected, or let's change the board structure or something like that. And I think I moved them successfully beyond, that. Because certainly in the business world, whenever things are messed up, the first thing you think about is reorganizing, and it really ought to be about the last thing you do after you've decided why things are messed up and what you need to do to fix it, and is there some reorganization that will work toward that particular end in solving those problems. And we really moved on to this question of, well, let's stop talking about what higher education needs and try to figure out what is it this state needs out of this higher education system. We asked the taxpayers to put huge amounts of money into it, and what is it that we need to do in return for that. And the more we got into it, the more it came down to the subject of college completion. Now, there's lots of other things out there. But when you sort of picked what's the one thing that would really make a difference in Tennessee, we came down to this issue of getting more kids through through college. Um, the, um, the, the Walmart explanation that I gave to people of this was I said, look, if you've got a store that's not doing well, okay, before you go out and advertise more or find a way to extend more credit, you ought to ask people who walked in the front door of the store and then walked out of the store without buying anything why they did that. And if you can figure out that, it'll help you a lot more with the strategy of where should you put your resources to make this more successful. Here's somebody who already was motivated to come to the store, already motivated to go to college, was unsuccessful in some way in doing so. Why? Okay. And it turned out to be a sort of a difficult question because the immediate reflexive answer of everybody was, well, it's all about scholarships. We need more money in scholarship funds. But when you dig into it, it's not about that at all. That certainly can be a piece of it. But the reality is, in a state like Tennessee, where you have it's an agrarian rural state, you've got a lot of people coming to college, and some of these ones who are having problems with the completion, who are the first person in their family who has gone to college. So what you got is you got some kid, and they're 18 years old when everybody's always messed up anyway. This is their first time going away to school. They may be the first person to go to college, so there's nobody to talk to in the family about what that's all about. They may have come from a school system that hasn't really adequately prepared them for it, so they're having trouble with some of the courses at the beginning. It's no surprise that after a while they throw their arms up in the air. They may have family situations back home in many cases that weigh on all those things. They throw their hands up in the air, and then in a sense, finding ways to support and solve some of those problems is likely to be a lot more effective in terms of moving people through to graduation and completion than simply saying, oh, well, we need to give them bigger loans or something like that. When we came down to that, it resonated with me tremendously. I'll be honest with you. I grew up in a very small town, 1,100 people. Went to a school system that had 1 through 12 school was the entire school system. My graduating class was 38 people. When I went away to Harvard as a freshman, they told me at the time, I haven't researched it independently, that I was the first person from that entire school system who in history had ever gone to an Ivy League school. Okay, so I get to Harvard from that background, where I'd sort of tried to learn a little calculus on the side, and all of my compatriots had taken 4 years at some private school somewhere, and it was the hardest 4 years of my life. It was a very difficult time in a whole host of ways. So I have this natural, I guess, sympathy for these kids who come out of these rural communities and they're faced with all of the challenges that college and being 18 and everything presents, and just really feel that if we're doing our job, we ought to be supporting them. Now, in order to address those, here's the specific things we did. Number one, we changed the funding formula for schools away from the number of students who were sitting in seats on October 15th or whatever the date was we measured. And basically, we changed it to 100% of the variable revenue in the system. And variable revenue means everything but things like capital expenditures and maintenance on buildings and things like that. It's all the personnel expenditures were considered variable. Is 100% performance-based, and the performance is almost entirely retention and graduation rates. And the way I describe to people is I want the college presidents, when they're having a shower in the morning, to be thinking about how do I help these students be successful and keep them in the school and get them graduated and get them out in the community with the tools that they need. Now, obviously, the schools in our system, just like in yours, there are different schools that serve different populations. We don't put the same standard on everybody. I mean, UT has a much more aggressive goal than the University of Memphis, which is a land-grant university that's dealing with a lot of inner city kids and everything else. But we set goals which were basically like No Child Left Behind. They were advancement goals on retention and graduation rates. And I think actually, Margaret would know, but I think Tennessee is probably the state that's the furthest over there of any state in terms of performance-based funding for higher education. Would that be correct from, yeah, it's certainly pretty close there. It has worked very well. First of all, it has enjoyed broad support in the legislature from both sides of the aisle. Conservatives like it because it's accountability. Liberals like it because you're given a helping hand to a lot of kids who need a helping hand. You can see in the budget proposals that have been brought forward that they're thinking a lot more, and there's a lot more thought going into now, okay, how do we fund, and how do we put things, what kind of support systems we need for these students to get them through, and so on. The one problem that it's had is that because the funding pool is essentially limited, you set the schools in competition with one another. If I get more money because of that, that probably means some other school is going to get less, almost certainly means it's going to get less. And so it probably has hurt the cooperation between schools that is often needed to do joint programs and the like. If I had it to do over again, I would find a way to get into that, to get into those issues, some way to reward that kind of cooperation as well. But that changing of the funding formula has been made a huge change in the system and in the law. The second thing which we did, and this I hesitated about mentioning it because I wasn't sure if it was relevant to you, but I'm thinking about it, I think it actually is we facilitated the transition from community college into the four-year colleges. I recognize that you don't have the community colleges in your system, but there certainly is no reason that you can't be a part of a process to help kids who start at a community college to get into the four-year system and to graduate. And where that arose out of was I just had this epiphany that I discovered when I got into this, that community colleges were not what I thought they were. I mean, I had thought of them in terms of some place where people go in the evening to get a degree after work and so on. And they're not anymore. What they are is they're places that are an alternative to four-year colleges that kids are going to, and it's their full-time endeavor is to go to this community college. And the problem was what they would do is they'd go spend a couple years at a community college, and then they'd go to UT or someplace, and they'd say, well, this course and this course and this course and this course don't qualify. We're not going to give you credit for those. And this poor kid has just spent now 2 years doing this stuff, and half the courses they took they're not going to give him credit for. Those decisions, those articulation agreements were between an individual community college and the dean of the appropriate school. So the big change we made is we just said, look, we are going to, every community college catalog is going to have every course clearly marked. I told them to put one in red and one in black. I don't think they actually did that, but clearly these courses are usable for credit in any four-year school, and we forced them to have the agreement so that all the four-year schools agreed on that and accepted those courses. So these kids, there's just truth in advertising. I mean, these kids knew what courses that they could take that were then usable. And then we combined that with if you complete the 2 years of that and these courses, you are guaranteed a spot in one of the four-year schools, except for UT, which has an admissions selective admissions policy, and interestingly, once we did that, most of the privates in the state adopted the same set of policies. So you'd find, except for Vanderbilt, that all the privates in the state are doing exactly the same kind of thing right now. It really has eased that transition. And interestingly, even at UT, which is the most difficult of the schools, the students who come into UT through the two-year program do better than the students who entered as freshmen in a four-year program. So just facilitating that transition and just being fair to these kids about, if you spend your money on this, what are you doing? A third thing that we did in that regard was we took the remediation completely out of the four-year schools. There are unfortunately always kids are going to need remediation of some sort. It's all done in the community colleges now, either on campus in the community college or on the four-year campus by community college instructors. They pay community college rates for those courses, and they get credit for those courses if they're credit-bearing courses. So you don't have some poor kid coming in looking at 4 years of school, but then you got to have 5 years because the first year is spent on remediation courses for which you get no credit toward your degree. You're trying to help move people along, and I think those have been very, very helpful. There have been other things we've done to facilitate the Oak Ridge UT interaction and so on, but I think these things that I've mentioned here with the better, that are all focused on this issue of retention and graduation rates have got, as I described before in a strategic plan, I think if they've got some bite to them. We said that we're not going to worry about these kinds of things. We're going to try to focus on this, and it's been quite successful. I think the secret of the success of it has been we worked really hard to get buy-in on the front. I say this committee that I told you about was a lot of people with different ideologies and different views of the thing, and kind of came together to support that. We did this late enough in my term that we knew who all the candidates were for governor were. So I brought them all in one by one and got them to sign on to the program. So all of the governor's candidates had signed on to the program before they got into office. And then I think also just because it is focused outward. It's not about what do the schools want. It's about, how do I get my kid who I'd like to have a college degree? How's this system going to help him or her to attain that college degree and the benefits that it's going to give them in their life. I had an example when I was mayor. I had three property tax increases during the 8 years that I was mayor. Two substantial, meaningful ones. One small one for something else. And the secret to getting it done, which I think is the secret to what I've just described here, was I never went in and said, I need more money to run the government. They were always done in the form of, I've got enough money, I can run the police department and the fire department and the public works department and all those kinds of things and the clerk of courts and all those things. Now, I'd like to build some new schools, okay? And it's not I want money for education. I want to build a new high school in Antioch. I want to build 4 elementary schools at these addresses, okay? These very specific kinds. You can pick or choose if you want those things. And what I found is people very willing to spend money when there's a transaction. They understand what they're getting for it, and they can decide, do I want to spend 2 cents on my property tax rate in order to have these elementary schools built? And they quite easily said yes to those things. And I think there's a similar lesson in higher education there, that if you can come up with some things that are sort of very specific that you can do, I think it's a lot easier to talk legislators and really, legislators respond to their constituents, to talk to their constituents about the needs that you have to make those things happen. I want to just finish with this. I think you can see from the conversation how deeply I believe in higher education. And it's probably for a slightly different reason than people often give. It's not because of the private value of higher education. A young man or a young woman will probably make more money with a college degree, and I think that's nice. But the real reason I believe so strongly in it is because it's I see it as a public good, that the society we live in will be better, it will be healthier, will be more productive, will be a better place to live because of what higher education has to offer. Economics, if you took the Economics 101 course, that the wealth of nations and the quality of life in nations it's all tied to productivity. There's no secret to getting additional wealth or additional quality of life in economic life in a nation. It's tied to productivity. We have, of the elements of that, we've got the financial capital in this country. That's not a constraint on our productivity. We have the natural resources in this country. It's not a constraint on our productivity. We certainly have the technology. That's not a constraint on our productivity. The constraint is the human capital, that we need more people who've got the whole variety of skills that higher education has to offer, and that's the critical path to continuing to grow the wealth of this nation and the quality of life and the options that people have in this country. So I really think the role of a group like this in doing a strategic plan is not only to create better lives for graduates, but also to create a better and more just society for this country and certainly for North Carolina. It's a personal issue with me. I just closed with one short story. I grew up, I told you, in that small town. I was with my grandmother. And living with us in the house was my Uncle Ozzie and his wife. Lyle Oswalt was his name. Ozzie was a very intelligent guy. I learned a lot from him, and he worked very hard. I like to fancy myself as being intelligent and hardworking. He was every bit my match in terms of that. Ozzie worked as a milkman when they still delivered milk in the morning, and later as a bookkeeper for a Chevy dealership. I became a public company CEO and a governor, and as near as I can make out, the main difference in our two lives is that he left at the end of 6th grade because he had to, and I had a chance to go to Harvard. And that, to me, encompasses this. I mean, Ozzie was happy. I'm sure he would have loved to have more money, but his life was not constrained because he didn't feel he had enough money to do things. He owned his own home, and he had a cottage up on the lake and those things. But you ask yourself, what other things might he have accomplished if he'd had the same opportunity? I mean, how many millions of Americans are there today that work far below their potential to contribute to this society? How many might have been engineers or doctors or inventors or entrepreneurs with a little bit of help from higher education? And how much, if that were the case, how much better a place might America be if they were? Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Governor. I tell you, you've given us an awful lot to think about this morning. It's I had a chance to meet Governor Bredesen last night, and I got a little preview, but this was excellent. Thank you very
Nobody
much.
threw anything. That's the mark of a good speech if you're a politician.
We do have a few minutes for questions, so I'm sure there are a number out there. Champ.
Governor, you spoke of your changes in your model and focusing to a large extent on graduation rates and retention. I'm curious as to how in your model graduation rates are determined as we get into more and more non-traditional students. The old 6 years, which captured only incoming freshmen and used years, may not be the best because we have people that are going more than 6 years but taking fewer hours than the people who do go 6 years, and it leaves out that increasingly large number of people who don't come into a particular university as a first semester freshman. So how are you doing it in Tennessee?
The answer to that is I don't know how they're defining it, and as a matter of principle, I tried not to define that in the legislation. I've always been, I guess you're out of the, as I've described, you're out of the business world, and I've always been an admirer and disciple of Peter Drucker. And one of his principles of business is that the CEO of a company ought to do only those things that only the CEO can do. And I think that applies everywhere, that the governors ought to concentrate on doing only those things that only the governor can do. Even that is more than one person can do. So I was very careful in putting these things together to say, I don't need to be defining all of this stuff because I don't know enough and I'm probably wrong on some of it. Let me put in place a process by which, in our case, THEC, Tennessee Higher Education Commission, which was the coordinating body for the two systems we have, would determine these within the parameters that we set. So the answer is they have a model, but I don't know specifically what it is, and it may well have changed in response to some of those circumstances. Best I can answer. And the same thing I say applies to boards. There's a lot of boards I've worked with where somebody just has to get into the well, if all the details of things, and I really think there's really important work for boards, and certainly a board like this, to do in terms of the overall strategy for higher education without getting your shoelaces tied together with, getting down in the weeds of things that you can get other people to do probably even better than you can in a situation like this. Yes, sir.
Let's see.
I'm sorry.
I've got Harry, Henry, and then Marty.
Yeah, my question is, I love the performance-based deal. I know there's a lot of governors on here. We've talked about it as well. And, we have some colleges that set the standard when it comes to retention rate and graduation rate. And quite frankly, we've got some colleges that are really struggling with the retention and graduation rates that we continue to fund.
Right.
As part of your process, did you guys also look at performance-based pay for your leadership at the college level? One of the things I've struggled with as we continue to deal with very large compensation packages. And from my perspective, I think that's what, mediates the people who do really great things. They should be compensated off the charts. And if you don't do really great things, you shouldn't be compensated at that level. Did you guys take a look at performance-based pay as part of your process and metrics?
I can't tell you that there's no component of that in the way the presidents are paid, but it is presidents in our system. But that is nowhere near as significant as the other. I think the attitude was kind of that it was politically difficult to make it significant enough that it really drove behavior. I mean, I'm out of the business world, and the problem you always find when in government you try to do performance-based stuff in terms of bonuses and stuff is what somebody comes up with is you can get 6% more in your paycheck if you do the following 32 things, and you don't end up driving any behavior because nobody can figure out what it is they're supposed to do. I mean, in the private sector, if you're the marketing director, you get a 50% bonus if you get over this number of widgets sold, and you know what you have to do, and it's driving it. So we did not focus so much on that. I also don't think the presidents are people who are primarily motivated by the salaries that they get. We opted to go for a funding formula that way, and I think we'd be open to considering doing it the other way. But I'll put it another way: even in business, I don't think you can manage through bonuses. If you have a business, I remember when IBM was sort of messed up and having trouble with the transition into services and all those things. I mean, if somebody had come along and said, well, the way we're going to solve that problem is we're going to set up these bonus plans for all these executives, I don't think you would have been very effective in solving the program. What you'd have to do is decide on the strategy, and then if one of the tools to execute that strategy is to give some spiff to the managers who make it happen, I think that's okay, but I think of it as a secondary tool.
Henry?
I just wanted to get you to elaborate a little bit about how the performance-based funding was set up. Is that primarily done on student success? What was the criteria? How did you set it up?
It was set up through THEC, and it was a combination of retention in the system, because we had people who were, coming in and then leaving in the middle of the year and so on and so forth. We wanted to retain them, and then graduation rates. And it does have a performance component to it, but the big issue is retention. What I wanted them to be thinking about was, how do I help these students to stay in this school and pass their courses and get a degree and get out into the workplace, to keep it simple that way. If you want to pursue this performance thing, I guess what I'm saying in a nutshell is there's a lot better people to talk to about it than me, because I put this in place toward the end of my time. A lot of the implementation has been done under Bill Haslam's tutelage, and somebody from THEC or John Morgan, who just left the Board of Regents over there, could come over and talk to you in great detail about that system and how it worked and what did and didn't work didn't work in the system. And I would certainly encourage you to do that. And I'd be happy to arrange it for you if somebody wanted me to do that. Yes, sir. Marty.
Your 3 points in your speech really resonated, probably more than the other ones that I've heard over the last 30 years.
From me or from others, you mean? Oh.
Focusing on what the state needs from the system is kind of a key element that sometimes gets overlooked. It's more inwardly focused. Evolving the business model is another major component that a lot of people are very resistant to. And then having a strategic plan with real choices, those are very hard things to accomplish in a bureaucracy. What are some helpful tips to get people to embrace that sort of a concept instead of fighting?
I mean, I don't know as there's a silver bullet. I mean, that's the process of managing people and managing the process of putting the strategic plan together and the like. And I'm not sure that I know a silver bullet to make that happen. I think that of all those things, the issue of convincing people that the business model really is changing and you can't just hope for a better year next year or hope the legislature will have a change of heart or something like that, that is not going to happen. that's something I think you can do by just really nailing what's happening with the finances of the state and how broadly it's happening and so on. And again, there are places like this Lincoln project that I'm on that could provide you with a lot of data that would help do that. I mean, I found on the Lincoln project, which is a group of, I mean, it was a very high level group of college presidents and the like, and that it was a very hard sell that it was about more than the legislature has gone crazy or something like that it was that. And the notion of saying, no, these are structural, and if you're really doing your job, you need to be a partner with the legislature in solving our joint problem, as opposed to one more petitioner knocking at the door and saying, give me, I'm more important than this or that or the other. But I think of all those things, really nailing that and getting people to really believe that business model has got to be looked at is probably key to getting most of that stuff done. Because if you really believe the business model's got to change, then you can't just have platitudes in a plan. You've got to really say, well, okay, here's how I'm going to respond, to these things. And again, whoever is chairing these meetings and organizing them, I mean, I think you can lead people in the direction of not doing that. The problem I've always found with meetings and having them is that any group you call together, they immediately expand the domain of what they're talking about. You just get. When I was mayor, I called a group together having to do with the HIV/AIDS crisis for a very narrow purpose, and it was like, we're supposed to be Healthcare City USA. There's a whole population of people who are too sick to work, but too healthy to be on Medicaid or in final term care. What are we going to do about them? And after they meet for a day, they come back and say, well, first of all, we need sex education in the schools and and stuff. And you sort of say, well, wait, that may all be true, and ultimately, world peace would help with all this too. But I just asked you a narrow question. So I think this issue of always just kind of like keep narrowing the question down and don't let these groups sort of get off into the nether regions can be really helpful in terms of developing strategies to do these things.
Laura, and then Joe, and then Madeline.
Thank you. Governor, as we try and collaborate with K through 12, I think Tennessee's been very successful with one program that addresses remediation, the sales program. And I wondered if you could just tell the board a brief outline of how that works, because you're actually addressing these seniors early on to get them prepared for higher education, especially in math.
Well, again, I'm probably not the right person to give the kind of details out on on that. It was the problem of coordination of K through 12 is that the only place in state government where the two of them intersect is in the governor's is in the person of the governor. I mean, from that point down, it's a totally separate kind of thing. Without talking about the civic program, we worked hard to try to identify coming in as freshmen that we could predict at that point who was going to need remediation and the like, and try to deal with that in the high schools, and then importantly, getting the four-year schools out of the remediation business and getting it into the community colleges, which has worked. So I'm not really answering your question. You may know more about the details of that program than I do. I apologize.
Program.
Good. Well, maybe you can tell the board about it.
Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Governor, I'm very honored to have you here and some one of your accomplishments to come and speak to us, and I really appreciate you doing that. But my question is, when we have a public university like we have, or any public institution, it seems to me there's a great pressure to democratize to the point that the institutions become mediocre. There's a sort of a leveling of standards, and I'm wondering if you incentivize schools to produce graduates, financially incentivize, I would almost guarantee that there will be more graduates produced because there will be more money received. However, how do you guarantee that the diploma actually represents real education as opposed to just going through a process? You told me, or you told us, and it resonated with me, that the 4 years you had at a very elite university were the hardest 4 years of your life. I'm sure you had a core curriculum where you took English and history and foreign language and mathematics and some very arcane sciences and so forth, very difficult. And the struggle and the difficulty is part of the educational process. How do you guarantee that a diploma is actually education and not just a stamp or something like the Scarecrow got at the Wizard of Oz?
I'll be honest, I worried a lot about that because you're right. If you incent producing more degrees, we're going to get more degrees. And in the end, I sort of came down and said, well, look, first of all, the people in these universities are professional people who have got standards, and we ought to place some dependence on them to continue to operate their institutions in a professional manner and consistent with the kind of high standards that they want, knowing that probably some will cheat a little bit on it, or something like that. But in the end, I think we just said we made a choice, which is to say, if you help some kids get through in success and get that degree, that is better than you were really, really tough on them and you managed, to shunt them aside, and now they've got a lot of student debt and they don't have a degree and they're discouraged and those other kinds of things. But no, that is a concern, and in the end, we said we think our faculties, we think our college presidents are professional enough and honest enough to not let the standards go south.
Could I ask? It's just one brief, and again, thank you very much. That's a wonderful response. But it seemed you were making some distinction between most of the schools in the UT system and the University of Tennessee itself. Mm-hmm. How did you do that, and how did you answer the charges of elitism and so forth?
We have actually, our system is broken up into two systems. We have a UT system, which has the research university and the medical school in it. It has a couple of other small schools by historical accident, but they're almost afterthoughts in the system. And then all the big state schools are in the Board of Regents system, along with the community colleges and technology centers. So there was a natural distribution there. But I talked a lot about the need to have in the state a premier research university. I mean, something I haven't talked about at all here was another significant initiative was to work with UT to say you need to start climbing up the ladder of public research universities. I mean, they were probably 48th or 49th in the U.S. News and World Report, and believe me, I know that has all sorts of problems with it, but I gave them the goal of I want to let's start out by being in the top 25, and pointed out to them, because a couple people were saying, well, we're a Southern university and rural state, and I said, well, we're not Massachusetts, and I said, well, actually, if you count the 10 top public research universities, they're in places like Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia and Texas, and so on. There's no particular reason why Tennessee can't play in that game, and that the strategy for doing it was a much closer set of relationships with the big national lab at Oak Ridge, concentrating on hard sciences and the stuff that Oak Ridge had to offer. So I never made any. I acknowledged that we were identifying one university as an elite research university that was subject to some different rules. I mean, they have a much different admissions process and so on. And you've got that here. You've got, I guess, two very high research and one high research university in the state here. Although here they're all part of one system, so you don't have the natural kind of dividing line that we did.
Thank you. We're running over, but I don't want to cut this off if somebody else has. I know Madeline has a question and Hannah has one. So Madeline, why don't you go first, and then we'll let the dean at the end finish the questions.
Well, I'll actually make this easy for you. Mr. Knott asked both of the questions I had, so I thank you for your responses.
I'm just curious about, is it working? Has the emphasis on completion, made a difference, and what kind of improvements have you seen?
Yeah, I tried to get, I apologize to you that when Margaret called me, it was like a week ago. So I didn't get all the sort of current research done that I might have liked to have done on that. But I did talk to John Morgan. The answer is yes, the rates have gone up, but I don't have hard numbers to give you here. I can certainly get some of those and send them over to the board. But I think there is no question but that the presidents have, I mean, their thinking is 45 degrees around to the side of where it used to be and much more focused on these retention issues. I said the best evidence to me was just in budget proposals, which now have a lot of stuff in them, which is oriented toward the retention and the support and the mentoring that these kids need to help complete successfully.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you all very much.